Good evening, fellow higher education enthusiasts, and welcome to this exciting episode of Higher Education Generation Live. My name is Jill Janofsky. I am the founder and CEO of Achieve College Counseling LLC, and I have with me this evening two amazing STEM professionals who have taught numerous students in different capacities, and they are big advocates of STEM areas. They're going to introduce themselves now, starting with Meredith.
Well, hi. Thanks so much for having me on, Jill. My name is Meredith Graham. I am a college counselor and STEM specialist. I jokingly refer to myself as being a STEM evangelist, usually complete with the jazz hands. I work for a company called CollegeWise, which is a private college counseling company. I've been with CollegeWise almost 10 years, but before I joined CollegeWise, I actually majored in chemistry in college. I studied at the College of Worcester, which is a little liberal arts college here in Ohio. And then my first job out of college was actually in research and development at Procter & Gamble. I worked in their corporate research division in a polymer processing lab, which basically meant I played with plastic all day. And we were working with biodegradable polymers, which was really interesting at that point. But I realized my heart wasn't really in it. So I went back to grad school for my master's in education at Kent State University in higher education and student personnel. And then after that, I spent 5 years at Purdue advising and recruiting students in engineering and math, statistics, actuarial science, and then the College of Science, so all the different science disciplines. And then I spent 7 years at Cornell University as Associate Director of Admissions in their College of Engineering. And so as a college counselor, because I have so much STEM experience, I tend to work mostly with STEM students and specialize in that for the most part. Not exclusively, but for the most part.
Great. And Dr. Lewis?
My name is Rebecca Lewis. Thank you so much for having me, Jill. I am a chemistry and, currently a chemistry teacher. I've been a public school teacher for 15 years in Massachusetts. Prior to teaching, I actually was on a different STEM pathway. I went to medical school. I had a lot of encouragement to go into medicine from my family and my community. It was someone who was good at science and liked to work with people. That was kind of like the automatic direction. But I actually always wanted to be a teacher ever since I was first aware of wanting to be something. So after I finished medical school, I started teaching, and I've taught in several different public school districts, all public high schools in Massachusetts. So I've taught in a kind of a small, I wouldn't call it rural, but a very, very small kind of isolated suburban community. I spent 9 years teaching in Boston public schools in two different schools, one of the exam schools and one of the lower performing. I put that in quotes because that's just based on one way of looking at school data, schools. And then I am just finishing up my 5th year at Hingham High School, which is an affluent suburban community outside of Boston.
Thank you, ladies. So before I start my questions, I just want to remind all of our viewers to please follow me on YouTube. That is the main landing base for this new podcast that I've launched. Please subscribe. But now that that's my my little plug is there, we're gonna jump into the questions. Okay. So first question on my mind as someone who is interested specifically in academic advising. This talk in the US of a STEM shortage throughout my education and throughout my college years, that was almost like a term that was on auto repeat. There is a STEM shortage, leading people to believe that majoring in STEM-based areas was sort of the way to a good job or a stable career. First, can I ask both of you, define exactly what STEM majors are? Why are they important? And how does that dovetail with this talk of a supposed STEM shortage?
I can go. I guess I would define STEM as anything in health, medicine, scientific research, engineering, maybe even things like architecture, like any sort of job heading in one of those directions, or even more of like an academic position in one of those fields. I don't know. I guess I would like to hear from Meredith, and then maybe we'll come back to the shortage question.
Yeah, I mean, I usually sort of talk about STEM as being anything in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, just like the acronym. And I think within STEM, there's sort of the traditional disciplines that people think about. So, the math, the geology, the chemistry kinds of things. But then you also have like some more applied sciences. So, areas like, if you're heading into like physical therapy or things like that, or some more sort of niche areas like entomology. And then, architecture could be considered STEM. Some places would consider it that. It's sort of on the intersection between, STEM and the arts in some ways, which then gets us into STEAM, which is a whole other thing. And so there are, a lot of sort of really specific and specialized different areas within STEM as well, if you sort of want to sort of branch it out, as well as applied areas too.
That's a great explanation. Thank you so much. I want to go back to this question about the STEM shortage. Do we have a STEM shortage? And is it true that majoring in one of these areas is a guarantee, so to speak, for a stable career at the end of it?
So I think there are two different answers to that, actually. Is there a STEM shortage? When you look at things like the Occupational Outlook Handbook and sort of look at like what's predicted for high growth professions, generally speaking, there's pretty high demand for STEM. With that said, is it a guarantee for a lucrative career? Not necessarily. I mean, the skills, and I think the thought process that goes into being studying STEM really stands you in good stead when you're headed out into the workforce, no matter what you end up doing. I mean, so the different skills. I majored in chemistry and I don't directly use those skills in a lab anymore, but the things that I learned when I was studying STEM, when I was studying the sciences, I actually do apply every day. Is there a shortage? Is there demand? Yeah, definitely. I think that there is, although it's not evenly distributed among the different STEM areas.
I was going to say, I don't think there's anything that's a guarantee to a stable, high-paying job. And, I think that part of the question like really speaks to kind of a mentality I see in my students, and just like this like, okay, like if I just check off these boxes that I'm on this path, but like there's also the personal investment and the work that you do that's going to actually get you to have the skills, the knowledge, the passion that you need to pursue whatever job or career you're interested in. And I guess I do think that there are a lot of jobs in STEM. It's a very broad field that includes, as Meredith was mentioning, like the acronym could even expand to STEAM, right? So we're talking about a really like wide range of different career options, which gives many possibilities to students. In terms of whether or not there's a shortage, I mean, I don't know that I have any real expertise to be able to answer that question, other than what I know, what I hear. My husband's in medicine, so I hear about things at work and just things I observe in my own experiences. I think there are certain parts of it that are probably overpopulated with people trying to pursue that particular path, like getting an MD and going to medical school. But meanwhile, there are all these other ways that you can be involved in patient care that are unrecognized, that are stable, productive career paths that actually are really in a shortage right now. So last week I went for my physical, and they had such a staffing shortage that the person who took me in from the waiting room and did my vitals was my own doctor. I personally loved that. I thought it was a great patient experience, but that indicates to me a really severe shortage in these other roles that have important contributions, especially in a clinical setting.
Well, and also roles that you don't necessarily need specific STEM degrees to pursue, correct?
Right, or not. And you definitely don't necessarily need to apply to a 4-year college or a very expensive college program to be able to get the credentials needed to start in a field like that, and then potentially pursue something else later.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think that there's a lot of times there's such an emphasis on the 4-year degree that we forget that, I think it was Brookings Institute did a study about 10 years ago that talked about the hidden STEM economy. And they were talking about how, a lot of the STEM jobs that are out there are actually at the certificate or associate's degree level and not necessarily at the bachelor's level or beyond, which I don't know that gets enough sort of, notoriety, I guess, enough sort of conversation about that.
Definitely. And even among 4-year degrees, I feel like for myself, it was always like medical school, medical school, medical school. And then when I got to medical school and actually did rotations, I saw that in many areas of medicine, there were actually roles that were more of interest to me that were not being filled by MDs. So there's other pathways. There's, which I guess speaks to the multitude of career options in STEM, but just there's not only just one desired outcome, even if you want to be a clinician.
So, of course, we're here to talk about a variety of STEM areas in medicine and outside. But I'm actually going to direct my next question to Rebecca, who is a STEM educator for teenagers in high school, and I want to know your opinion on the current state of STEM education at the high school level. Obviously, we just came out of a very hard period for educators around the world. I would imagine that that extended also to any type of science educator not being able to come together to do instruction. I want to know if you believe that high school students in the that high schools in the U.S. are training their students well in this area. Why or why not?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question. And I don't know that I could really fully speak to what's happening at all high schools across the US. I can speak to my own experiences and ones I've heard about. I mean, I think in some ways there are students who are being served very well by the school that I work in, and then there's others who are not. That's probably the case in many schools. I would say that my high school is somewhat traditional. In terms of teaching approach, and we have sort of a lot of tracking in terms of how students get access to higher level classes that has been shifting over the past 5 years since I've been there, for sure. But there are students who do really well in those lecture type learning courses and figure out how to learn that way, how to study or find that enriching, and go on. And definitely we have students who go into STEM and are successful. And then I think we also have a lot of students who have kind of lost their spark for learning. Especially I've seen it, like I don't, when I think about what it's like teaching now compared to 4 years ago before the pandemic, it's still not the same. Like I still think students at the high school level are struggling. It's probably not specifically just in their science classes, but in their student engagement in general. And I run a professional learning community for teachers in my school, and we had our last meeting of the year yesterday, and the dilemma we were discussing was the dilemma of intrinsic motivation, and that missing piece that's making it so that we're seeing the kids are not acquiring the skills they need over the course of the year. So in chemistry, we need them to be able to do basic unit conversions and convert between grams and moles fluently enough that they can use it when it comes up in a problem. We're seeing they're just not committing enough to really get the skills each time to actually accumulate them over the course of the year. So if you look at the trajectory of learning over the course of the year and what's going to be missing. So that was kind of a lot of different pieces of the question. I'll pause for a moment. We can dig into any of those a little bit more if you want.
Well, I do want to dig into that because as an academic advisor, sort of receiving students from the high school pipeline into college, one of the things I noticed, first of all, a lot of students, I mean millions, in the United States have huge deficits in math and also English, but we're here to talk about STEM. So they have deficits in math education and frequently will need to be remediated at the college level in math. And then they tell me, they're like, well, I want to major in nursing because I think, that's a stable career. But nursing requires a lot of knowledge of math and science. And this was knowledge that the students didn't have a good foundation for, like, to start with. So, I mean, that's a concern that I've always had, like, in the advising field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I see that on my end too, and I've struggled with it as an AP chemistry teacher, how much it requires students to be putting together skills and acquiring them and deeply learning, not just checking this off, passing this in, this task completion approach to school that I think we've drilled into our kids, and they need to really step back from that rush to get things done, to actually deeply understand and learn. I definitely see it in my students' math skills too. I mean, especially as a chemistry teacher, I'm depending on them to be able to do simple algebraic manipulation, nothing crazy in chemistry, but like just to solve an equation where there's like 5 equals 2 over x. And I can't seem to get them to consistently do that. It's very hard to teach that skill when you're trying to teach it in the midst of content and they're not coming in with that. So then what happens next, right? So how do we actually cross that hurdle? Yeah, it's very challenging.
Meredith, do you have anything you'd like to say on this issue?
I mean, in terms of the all of the different pieces of education, I mean, I do see with my students as well, you know, that some of the same kinds of deficits you're talking about, in terms of, I mean, I don't see in the academic, like in the classroom kinds of things, but I do see it in the soft skills as well, like some of the time management in particular. You know, I know that my sense of time has been completely decimated by the pandemic, and I see that with my students as well. So in terms of like meeting deadlines and things like that, that also, you know, in time management, figuring out how to sort of space out their time, because, you know, when you're learning from Zoom for a year, you don't have to remember to travel to and from school. You don't have to factor that in, and the fatigue that you know, that sort of inspires and everything as well. So I think that I think that there are a lot of different pieces that go into that sort of shortage, if you will. And I am worried, you know, when you think about, and Rebecca, you, I'm sure, lived this, you know, that first year where the APs were truncated because, you know, you couldn't go back to school. And so, you know, the College Board said, okay, we're going to do these AP exams that are only going to cover, you know, 2/3 instead of the full cycle of what should have been covered. But we're still going to expect colleges to offer the same credit for that. How does that really work? So, like, have students truly mastered that content if they're heading off to college now? I would argue probably not. But again, then the colleges, then to your point, Jill, are trying to figure out where are those deficits, and if it's in a core area like math or English, you know, you have to figure out how to account for that without necessarily, you know, upending your entire curriculum at the college then as well, which is really hard.
Yeah, so actually, my next question is for you, Meredith. So Meredith is what we call an IEC, an independent educational consultant, as I am. That's kind of just a more formal way of describing us. And part of our job is that we are managing expectations of both students and their parents. And I'm sure I'm not alone when I see this, but a lot of the time, like, I'll be working with families, and the parents are very, very insistent that they want their kid to study something in the STEM area. Maybe because they did it or because they see it as kind of like a pathway, but the kid clearly doesn't want that. And they will, sometimes they will even say, like, out loud, oh, well, I hate math and science. But yet they're being pushed, you know? So how do you go about advising students and families in this way?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the trickier kinds of things, and I run into it a lot, as you do as well. I've been in IEC now for almost 10 years, so I've had these conversations a lot of times. Um, and I know my thinking and my approach to it has evolved over the last decade as well. You know, I think especially at first, you know, I was really trying to sort of persuade them that that's not the best path for them. But you know, I've sort of come around in some ways because, you know, for some students and for some families, this is something where this is a particular value for them. And I've come to realize, like, it's not my job to tell them that what they hold to be a value is right or wrong. So usually when I work with a student like that, I sort of try and talk about what, you know, where is this coming from? Where is your STEM interest coming from? Is this a genuine interest, an intrinsic interest? Or is this, you know, something where somebody else is telling you you have your choice? You can either major in this or that. Those are the only two options. And if it's that, then okay. Then, you know, from a where should you go to college kind of a perspective, if it's a student who, you know, says this is what my parents expect me to do, but I don't actually have any interest in it, then we try and focus on finding colleges that will help them, be able to explore their own interests while also sort of honoring their parents' expectations. So sometimes that means a college where they can go in undecided and say, hey, I would have the option of majoring in chemistry or biology or physics, or maybe I'll end up majoring in linguistics or economics or something else along the way. But finding places where they can be happy and successful within that total context. And then once they're in college, places that I know will support them in that journey, and then hopefully help them either be able to figure out how to align their path with their parents' expectations, or be able to sort of have those conversations with their parents about this is not the pathway for me. And again, that's a very sort of delicate kind of a thing when you're talking about family dynamics. So I try and help equip the students to have those conversations as they see fit. Without trying to sort of mandate that for them. Then the other piece is, how as a student, if you don't like math and science, if you're applying to a place where you have to be admitted directly to that major, how exactly are you going to compete if you don't like math or science and you're not good at them in high school? Like if you're going to apply as an engineering major somewhere and you're getting, B's and C's in math and science classes, you're not going to be as compelling an applicant. You're not going to be as competitive an applicant. So sort of talking about what does that look like?
It is amazing to me how many students I've worked with through all different types of institutions and communities who take who have that view, like, oh yeah, I'm going to apply for engineering, and they are terrible. Well, I don't want to say terrible, but they're not strong in math, and they know that. So there is like an educational component, like you have to be good at what you're pursuing. I mean, that's my general philosophy.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because if you don't, I mean, on the advising side, once upon a time I sat in that seat as well, where the students were there and their skills and their interests weren't matched with the courses they were taking in college. And it was, I talk a lot about it being like time-lapse photography. You can either see a student blossom and grow, or you can see them wilt if they're in something that's a mismatch. So one of the things that I do talk with students about, if they think they want to study engineering, but maybe their math isn't as good, that's one of the places where engineering technology comes in, because engineering technology is a really great parallel with engineering. And at a lot of places that offer both engineering and engineering technology, they do offer sort of the parallel kinds of areas, but the math skills that are required aren't quite as rigorous. They're more applied rather than theoretical. And so sometimes I can get a student and a family to sort of see that as a viable pathway that's, of equivalent, lucre and security or whatever their particular goals are.
Yeah, and I want to talk about this concept of college goals, because so I should probably say I am not a STEM person and never have been. I satisfied my lab requirements in college by taking psychology, and that's just because I was very phobic of all of that. Like I've never been very good with numbers. It's just not the way like my mind works. I was never very compelled like in any of my science classes. I just accepted as a teenager really that I was much better in different subjects, like in English and in languages and such. But but the unintended consequence of that is that it limited me somewhat, because when I got to college, I'm like, oh, I'm not touching that. I'm not approaching, a class requiring labs. So I guess I'm asking this to both of you. What advice would you give to someone like in my position who might be like a little bit phobic of these areas, but college is a time for self-exploration. You should be dabbling in different areas. What advice would you give to someone like that?
Nice.
I have so many things written down that I was thinking about during the last part of the conversation, but I do think some of them connect. I think you brought up the idea of college goals, right? What is the purpose of going to college? And I feel like there's this tension between this practical purpose of like, go through it to get this degree, to get this certain job, to get pay, to make a living so you can buy a house, etc. Like it's very like practical thinking about it. And then there's this like philosophical side of college about like learning and exploring and like becoming a well-rounded critical thinking human. And I do think those are at odds with each other, especially with the cost of college. I guess that kind of speaks to just like what are the goals of the college experience. But I think in terms of like STEM phobia, which is like another part of your question, like, I guess I would say that I myself have had very negative experiences in various different science classes that I took, especially
And you're saying
my
this as a STEM person, so
yes.
that's
Oh, absolutely. And like, I didn't think I had any interest in science at all. I never liked my science classes until I got to chemistry in high school. I was just like, yeah, this is boring. I'm just memorizing stuff. And I didn't see the problem solving, thinking, engaging, actually doing science, part of science until my high school chem class. And partly why I had that experience then was because of how my teacher taught the course, which I definitely feel myself channeling that, like, especially when I first started teaching AP Chem, and now I have my own identity as a teacher that I bring to it. But I think a lot of science education. I don't know how familiar you are with the NGSS or Next Generation Science Standards, but there was a big push. They came out in like around 2014, 2015 in Massachusetts. I know adopted a new version of their science standards for high school science education in 2016. This was 7 years ago. Granted, we've had a 3-year pandemic experience, but from what I see, we have not actually adopted those standards. We've checked that we're still teaching the right content, but the big shift was to actually build science practices into science education. And what that means is teaching students and giving students the experience to engage in the work that scientists do, asking questions, developing models, planning investigations, interpreting their own data. A lot of students aren't actually having that experience in science labs to even know that they might like science. Maybe they've just dissected a fetal pig and they hated it.
um,
Yeah. And I would say, as you're saying that, Rebecca, it's funny, like my majoring in chemistry was actually a lark. Like it was not, I didn't go to college planning on majoring in chemistry. I planned on majoring in something in the social sciences, but similar to you, like I always liked science. I thought it was fun. But my high school chemistry class was really fantastic. And then when I got to college and I knew I needed to take a science class for, general education requirements, I told my advisor, who was a sociology professor, that I wanted to take chemistry. And he was like, "Are you sure about that?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I took it in high school and it was fun." And he was like, "Okay." And I didn't realize at that point that the college I was at had an incredibly strong chemistry program. It was considered to be, by the American Chemical Society, was considered to be one of the top small college programs at that point. So I had no idea. I just thought it was fun and I ended up being good at it. And so then I sort of, lots of support. So similar to the story you were telling, Rebecca. But when we're talking about like students being STEM phobic and trying to, sort of keep options open for themselves too, one of my friends who is a mathematician gets really annoyed when people say, "I'm so bad at math," and their eyes glaze over and everything. And I'm so bad at that because we wouldn't ever let somebody say, "Oh, I'm so bad at reading and I could never do that." Like we would never sort of okay that in our society in the same
well,
way.
I'm gonna stop you right there.
Yeah.
So it has, in my opinion, become socially acceptable to say that you don't like to read. Like I don't read. I don't like to read, and that has become completely okay. I mean, unfortunately, I think it is more socially acceptable than you're suggesting.
And maybe it is more now than it used to be, but still I would say if you're going to put those two head to head, somebody saying like, "I can't do math, I'm terrible at math, keep me away from it, I'm terrified, like I am incapable of math," people are more likely to say that. But the number of people who will say like, I choose not to read, I don't like reading, I don't enjoy it, I don't feel like it's something I want to choose to engage in, that is different to me anyway than somebody who says, "Oh my gosh, I can't read." Like illiteracy, there's still sort of a stigma against that, and that's still a problem. But I understand what you're saying. Like not a lot of people read for fun anymore, or it's socially acceptable now to say, "Well, I don't read books for fun." Like the last thing I read was a graphic novel 5 years ago. Like, so I understand what you're saying about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to talk about like career goals and how they affect your advising of your students. So when you have students who are thinking about or intent on very specific goals like medical school or getting a PhD or any type of really post-secondary option that requires probably some education after college, what is the best advice you could give them?
Mm, I feel like there are so many different elements of that are possible. What's the best advice? I mean, keep your eyes open and keep challenging yourself. You don't necessarily know where, where you're going to find your inspiration and your passion. Um, you know, I will sort of defer to Rebecca if she wants to talk about sort of the pathway to medical school. I think a lot of times students, if they want to go into medicine, they assume that they have to be biology majors, which is not at all true. You also don't have to major in pre-med. There are fewer than 100 colleges in the US that have a pre-med major. That's truly something where you can have a major of pre-med. There are lots of places that offer support in a pre-med track, but to say like, I am majoring in pre-med in college, there are only about 100 places you can do that. And so you can get the courses you need for med school in any other way. And so for a student who says, well, I want to go to med school, I encourage them to think about, where are you going to be able to perform the best in your courses? Where are you going to be most excited to learn? Because you don't have to major in chemistry or biology in order to go to med school. Now, if you want to, great, but you don't actually have to do that. For a student who's interested in, studying engineering or going on for a research degree, that's a little bit, it's a little bit different. I do still think, encouraging them to be, keep engaging in creativity. Again, sometimes there's sort of this sense that, if you're in STEM, you can only be in STEM and you can't be interested in, the arts. And that's, not true. Being creative is actually a really key component to being a successful STEM professional. Also, being a good team player is a really important part of it as well. And that sometimes gets overlooked too. So encouraging students to, stick with, a calculus track in math as long as possible in high school, challenging themselves in the sciences. The calculus track thing in particular is really important. And I think a lot of times, students don't necessarily realize that or don't think about that. But, a student who steps away from the calculus track while they're in high school really, even if it doesn't hurt their admission, it really throws a wrench in things usually in their first semester of college, because it's like getting hit by a truck that first semester if those skills aren't fresh.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with what you're talking about the high school pathways and then how that impacts options in the future. And that's something that we've talked about a lot within my science group of teachers at my school, about like the weird messaging kids are getting from the school, where there are a lot of kids who like don't seem to have a path to calculus in high school, and how, like, I remember when I was in high school, that was kind of like a bare minimum expectation that you would have a year of biology or a year of chemistry or a year of physics. You would get to calculus in high school, whatever level of it, not necessarily AP, but some information about it as a foundation for the future. And what I see in my school is that we have a lot of science electives, and it's become really common or not uncommon for kids to not even take physics in my high school and instead take anatomy and biotech or something like that, which are great classes that are super interesting, but to me, like, not at the expense of taking this core science that's just going to give you just the foundation of that subject. And to me, that in high school, that's a great opportunity to just get a little bit of a grounding in each of these core science areas to prepare for the future. So that to me feels like a huge loss.
And that actually will close admissions doors in some cases too. Like I know, that physics is an actual admission requirement for a lot of engineering programs. So a student who doesn't get a year of physics will literally be closing the door on their opportunity to be applying for that program. So
and then their only oh no, not at all. That their only option then at that point would be to take physics in college without any background for it, even though many other students probably have taken high school physics to just get some of the basic ideas, and then transfer right into an engineering program. Is that what the path would be?
That would be the only option if they decide if they want to be an engineer. They would either have to start and then transfer into an engineering program at the college, or do a 4-year degree and then go on for like a master's in engineering, which is also theoretically a possibility. It's a little complicated sometimes, but theoretically is a possibility for students to do that.
That's interesting. I mean, that definitely affirms my own concerns about the practice that I see. And, it's interesting because a lot of it's coming from guidance and advising, and just, if a kid says, I definitely don't want to go into engineering or science, but they're 16, so they don't necessarily know what they want to go into. And like, so I'm just going to take a different science class instead, or I'm just not going to take science as a senior. And that's our job as a school to help them know like what they need.
There definitely is a very major academic advising component, I think, to, and well, for any student, but especially I think at the high school level when you're dealing with college bound, students, because I feel like, oh, anatomy, that sounds like something so practical, and there's this thing we have right now about like practicality versus like more of a long term investment, if that makes sense. And part of our job is to explain, like, no, like physics, it may not sound as fun or as practical as anatomy, but it's foundational. Like that term is, it's so important.
Yeah, that's exact, that foundational. To me, I don't know, maybe I'm traditional, like, but I view biology, chemistry, and physics as the foundational sciences upon which other sciences are built. And like to really truly understand anatomy and physiology, you actually do need knowledge from all three of those disciplines. Maybe it's not as heavily laying on physics as it is on biology or chemistry, but it's there.
And I can remember when I was at Purdue and working there, I was primarily advising first year students, the first year engineering students, those first couple of years. And I remember the engineering faculty members talking about sort of what skills were needed for success in the future classes, sort of, once they were sort of transitioning to their actual majors. And the number of students who would say, well, I hate chemistry, I don't want to take chemistry. Why do I have to take chemistry? If they were going to be doing, like a mechanical engineering or something that didn't seem like it was directly related. And the faculty reinforced over and over and over again that it was partly the content of the course, but a lot of it was the sort of the mental pathways and the understanding how to solve those kinds of problems. The students could see the connection with the physics, but they couldn't see the connection with the chemistry. Being able to hear that from the faculty members that like, no, it's thinking through and understanding how to approach these problems in chemistry. That as much as anything as the chemistry content is what we really need you to have. Then that helped me to be able to communicate that to the students.
Yes, that's those science practices, but within each discipline, and building your skills to approach a problem, to model a problem in different ways. Obviously, in chemistry, you're going to be thinking more about particle level explanations for things that are going on, but physics may be like more mechanical. But these are all just different ways of thinking about and conceptualizing a problem.
So, Dr. Lewis, to students, high school students who might be considering the AP program for these subjects, who would you recommend those courses to specifically? Anyone, or people who just have a stated interest in those areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the change initiatives that I've been working towards at my school is actually expanding AP chemistry enrollment because when I first got to the school, my first year there, I had only had 7 students in the course, and this is a high school of 1,200 to 1,300 kids. And in my previous school, which had been the same size, we had 70 students taking AP chemistry, and that was in an urban school with, I'd say, a wider range of life and background experiences of students. That being said, the dynamics are very different. So I think where I am now, there's this external pressure, like take as many APs as possible, get these APs on your resume. You should sign up for AP classes, like get them on your transcript, boost your GPA, which is an illusion, by taking AP classes because it's how it's weighted in our school, which I know is not what colleges use that data for anyway. And so then, those to me those are not good reasons to take AP. On the other hand, I think there are definitely more than 7 to 10 qualified students who actually could find a love of chemistry, find a passion for it, and build skills for the future each year at my school. So the class is much bigger now. We've had between 30 and 45 students enrolled each year for the past 4 years, and will next year as well. And a lot more female students, students with more diverse linguistic and racial backgrounds, students who have special education needs, like who never took the course before. So I think overall that's a positive to increase that enrollment. But on the other hand, to me, like what I need is for them to actually be interested in chemistry and to be willing to have a productive struggle in their learning experience. Because if you're not interested in chemistry, you should not take an AP class that you're not interested in, because you're signing up to do a really deep dive into the content and to really wrestle with it and examine it over the course of the year. And so why do that for a subject that you really are not interested in? But then that second piece of I will commit to you as your teacher to support you through the course, no matter how difficult it is for you, but you have to commit to be willing to have that challenging experience of failing a test or just not getting something and having to work through that. So I counsel students about that when they come to me and ask about taking the class. Overall, it's been very positive. And, I always feel like there's a few kids who sign up that I'm like, each year I'm like, I don't know why this kid's here. And then every year I have kids surprise me with their growth who I would have said, I really don't know if this is a good idea, but they tell me like, I really want to do this.
You bring up an interesting point. Do you think it should be the choice of the student to take these higher level classes, or should it be decided by the educator? Because when I was in high school, I definitely remember there were some instances where a teacher could say, "Nope, you're not. You can't take AP. Whatever. You haven't shown that you're." In my course, you haven't shown the mastery that I've wanted to see from you. So I'm barring you from taking the AP class in this subject next year. What do you think about that? Like, do you think it should just be like an election that the student makes and the teacher just has to meet them at their level, or should the teacher be able to make that determination?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I personally do not feel that it is my right as an educator to deny someone access to the class. It is my responsibility to tell them and to help them understand what the experience will be like in as many ways as I can, by sharing my own experiences teaching it, by helping to connect them with students who have taken intro and then AP chemistry so they can tell them, like, this is what this was like. I got a 52 on my first test. Like, then this is what I had to do, so that they can understand what they're signing up for. I want them to be informed, but I don't feel that it is my right to say no to someone who wants to do it. And that might be different than other teachers in my own school. I mean, I think it definitely is. And I think what's made me have that opinion is that I've been wrong about my ideas about students so many times. I've had so many students where I'm like, oh man, I'm really concerned about this kid, and then just been blown away by what they've done. And maybe they didn't get a 4 or 5 on the exam, but wow, they really figured out how to study, how to learn, in ways that are going to be super impactful on that kid's future as they go to college and have that ability to recover from academic challenges and setbacks.
Yeah, and Meredith, I guess I'm going to ask you, when you're advising students and families who've hired you and they ask, is it better to get an A in like a slightly lower level course than struggle in the AP course, or is it better to challenge myself with the AP course and maybe not do quite as well?
Yeah, I feel like that is one of the most frequently asked questions, both with where I am now and also when I was on the admissions side of things. And to some extent, it depends on what, like, where we think the student will land grade wise and what kinds of colleges the students are targeting. I worked at one of those big fancy Ivies, and, at those places, the answer is super secret answer C. You take the harder class and you get an A. Ha ha ha. It's not funny, but we always used to sort of say that and joke about it.
Yeah, and kids bound for the Ivy League, totally, but 99% of students are not.
Right,
So
exactly. So for everybody else, the conversation is much more around, where do you think you're actually going to land in terms of your grade? And to me, taking the more challenging class, because college is school, taking the more challenging class is usually going to be a better idea unless the trade-off in a student's schedule and their mental health and their grade is too high. So a student who's going to be struggling to keep a B or might land with a C, I think that it's important to talk about, is this the right level for you? If it's a student who can earn an A or maybe a B in the class, but the amount of time necessary in order to earn that grade is so great that they have to give up sleep, their health suffers, they have to give up their extracurricular activities, that there are other parts of their lives that take a serious hit in order to earn that grade, then it's probably too much for them. So that's really sort of where the conversation centers when I talk with students. But if they can reasonably handle the challenge with a good amount of work, and come out with an A or maybe a B, then I think that's an appropriate level of challenge.
Yeah, I agree. That resonates with my thinking as well. And that's something I think I do more advising maybe than a lot of teachers do. But when kids come to me about AP chemistry, I talk to them about what else are you thinking about doing next year? Like, where are you stretching yourself? Like, I would love to see you stretch yourself in this domain, but I don't want to see you do that and then also stretch yourself in this domain and that domain and that domain. Like, you need to choose, like, what do you really want to invest in? Because it can't be everything.
Yeah.
Rebecca, do you think that there's grade inflation in science or in math courses at the high school level?
I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I honestly, like, I don't even know what grades mean anymore. Like, I feel like college admission seems so challenging to me because we
Yeah.
have these SAT tests that seem like an objective measure, but obviously have their own inherent biases. And then the kids' resumes and their activities can be full of all sorts of, different random things that they get access to through other means. And then there's grades, right? So I, even in my own class, like, I look at my students' grades and I don't know, like, do they mean what they should? Like, does their grade in their AP class actually have a relationship to their AP exam score? Should it always? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I definitely think, like, in my school, if you're getting below, well, the kids don't want to get below an A- on anything, but, like, definitely if kids are getting below an 80, that's like a parent conversation, so, and that's just the norms that are set by the community.
What do you think can be done to better evaluate students in these areas? Because I feel like people think, oh, it's so easy to, the grades are objective because either you know the formula or you don't. It's not like grading an essay that maybe even AI wrote for you, right? So, but you're challenging that. First of all, I mean, I'm a huge advocate. I don't think there should be letter grades anymore. I think that we need to move completely to a pass-fail system. That's probably a topic for a different podcast, really. But
I'll
how do
come to that one.
A good one, though. Yeah, yeah.
you're both very much invited, but since we're talking about STEM, and this is really a question for both of you, how do you think that the evaluation of students in these subjects can change, for the better for the future?
It's something that I've been trying this year, is to shift my grading practices, to be much more heavily based on assessments, or almost 100% assessment based, but to also offer opportunities for retakes. And so, one of the resources for this is a book called Grading for Equity that I've been working on with my professional learning community. And I do think the grades feel more aligned with what I see kids being able to do, because the grade is not completion points. Like, I think that's a big problem when we're giving kids, like, credit for compliance in school, and that's been valued by a lot of schools and grading systems. So I don't know. I'm hoping that will help. That the grade is actually what they're showing me that they can do, not necessarily just tests, but, like, in your lab work, what can I see that you're doing? And if you're not doing it, then how are we going to get you there? It's not just going to be you're going to write a reflection, but you have to actually show me later that you can do it.
And I would tend to agree with you that that I think better assessment of STEM involves much more, lab practicals and hands-on experiences, projects. You think about when you're actually out in the world, doing STEM. So if I'm in the lab doing my job, back when I was working in R&D, if there was something I didn't know, I could go look it up. I needed to know where to go look it up, but I could go look it up. So I didn't have to have, the friction coefficient of thus and such memorized. Like, I could go look that up. I didn't have to have the boiling point of ethanol locked in my brain. I could go look that up. I needed to know where, but I could do that. And so I agree, sort of decoupling, like, what are the essential skills where a student has to be able to demonstrate mastery on a timed assessment, like an exam of some kind, versus what are the things that need to be or are better assessed by a lab practical or a conversation or, some sort of mastery project. I think that that's really, really important. I think it's complicated to get there, though. And I think that's part of the challenge.
Yeah, that feels really overwhelming to me, to actually, like, get my teaching to that place.
Yeah.
What do you think is the best way to promote STEM among historically underrepresented populations? Populations that are still very much underrepresented in STEM majors and in STEM professional areas after college?
I was just going to say, I think that AP course access is a part of that, which is why I've been passionate about the goal of increasing access to AP Science in my school, especially seeing like that tracking early on can then really limit like certain populations from even having access to like an AP experience. That's obviously only one piece, but I think an important one, because that sets the stage for I didn't think I was good at science, but now I have this female role model teacher who's like helped me see that. And now I see a place for me in this field.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. Having role models, it's kind of interesting you're asking this. There's a group right now I've just sort of been following sort of quietly off to the side. There's an NSF grant right now that is exploring alternative credentials for STEM for students from historically underrepresented backgrounds. And they're looking at some of like the high quality summer camps that are, and so how can we use those as sort of like, okay, if a student does this high quality summer camp in STEM and they, come out of the summer program and they perform well successfully, that's a form of assessment. And, being able to use that as a credential to sort of say, hey, this is a student who has the skills, the knowledge, and the talent in order to be successful in STEM. And then that encourages the student, but it also then provides some kind of a connection, some mentorship, some people, showing them that you can do this and saying, you can make this transition. And then I do think a lot of support once the students are in college as well, because the STEM pipeline is really leaky once students are in college, and figuring out how to address that problem as well is a challenge.
So that actually segs into my last question. What types of exposure opportunities do you recommend to students who are in high school or maybe in college to get real world experience in STEM areas before deciding on a major, or before deciding on a career path in those areas?
So one of the things, I'm a big fan of informational interviews for students, particularly when it comes to something that would be like the engineering or the technology side of things. And that's a very scary thing for high school students. I know that. And they also have to have somebody in their network that they can go and ask questions of, which sometimes is a challenge that they, is hard to overcome. So when that's an option, I think having conversations, I have a whole like list of websites that I encourage students to go and look at. A whole, there's a YouTube channel there, Nova PBS, they don't run it anymore, but they used to have like a web series that was called The Secret Life of Scientists and Engineers, where it was like, somebody who was a pro athlete, but then was also a physicist on the side. And you could go and like hear a little bit about, like, watch a quick video about what were the two things, what was their, secret life. So I also think when possible, having students, pursue some kind of a summer program, even if it's a week-long summer camp that's like, here's an introduction to what it looks like to be an engineer. Here's what it looks like to, get your hands wet with science. Again, that's cost prohibitive for some students. There are scholarships available in a lot of those programs, although not all of them. But whenever possible, I think just getting something like that. There's sort of this push towards doing research during the school year. And there are, some different groups that, students can, sign up for and get a research mentor. And I think that there can be benefits to that as well. But again, there are some equity issues in there, because who can afford to pay for that? That's so that door is potentially closed for some students, and makes me less excited about them from that perspective.
Yeah, I share a lot of those same perspectives. And as Meredith was talking, I was just thinking, well, what opportunities and what access would my students in my school now have versus what opportunities and what access would my students in my previous school have had? And they're not the same. They're very different. Because in my school now, they can talk to so-and-so's dad who's a dentist, and so-and-so's mom who's a doctor, and someone who has a research lab at this elite university. And so they have a lot of access to learning about from people they know about these fields. But even with that, I think, we were talking earlier about how the being a doctor is not the only job you can do in medicine. There are many other roles in the hospital, but I think getting access to that is really challenging. Like, you can tell students to volunteer in a hospital, but I volunteered in a hospital in college, and I was just making beds in the PACU or for people coming out of surgery. So like, my access to really find out what everyone was doing and all these different options, I don't know how we can help expose that to students.
I will say the other thing that I'm a big fan of. I think that public libraries and librarians are really underutilized. The youth librarians and a lot of the libraries that I know, they really can help students, find information and access that they may not have elsewhere. And so, a lot of times I'll encourage my students to think about creating some sort of a passion project, and that might be a reading project. Go to the library and talk to the librarian and figure out how you can sort of pull together all the information you can about, a couple of years ago, I had a student who, saw an e-bike somewhere, like an electric, battery powered bike, and thought it was cool. And he wanted to study engineering, and he thought, I wonder if I could create one. And so he worked with the librarian and read everything he could get his hands on, and then made a design at home. And of course, he couldn't build it at home, but he actually like pencil paper sketched the design, and had his own whole design, and said, he was hoping to be able to build it for himself someday. I just thought that it was really cool, and it was free. All of that was free.
Well, ladies, thank you so much for participating in this really important conversation. I mean, it could go on for a really long time. And I think that I have new ideas for future podcasts as a result of this conversation. So thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank
for
you so
having us.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is great.
All right, everyone, we're gonna go offline now. Have a good night.